All right. We'll be, as I said, looking at Judges this morning, and I'm going to try to get through everything I want to say about Judges. What I want to do is, first of all, I'm going to talk about we're going to read through sections of the first couple of chapters of Judges to get the overall shape of the book. We'll talk a little bit about the chiastic outline that I have on the notes. And then I want to focus on several judges and the stories of several judges. Gideon and Abimelech, those pair of judges that are at the center of the book of Judges. I want to look at their stories because they highlight some of the key themes of the book of Judges. And then I want to talk about Samson, because Samson is, I think, a often misunderstood character in the book of Judges. And I want to give some defense. It's not a complete defense of Samson. Samson is not a sinless judge, but I think that he's often rejected and disparaged and treated as a wicked man rather than the just and faithful judge that he was by and large. The last thing I'll do is look at the final chapters of Judges. All of the Judges' stories are finished by chapter 16 of Judges. That is, by the end of the Samson narrative. But Judges continues on for another 5 chapters, and there aren't any judges in those chapters. Different kinds of characters show up, and different kinds of stories are being told in the last chapters of the book of Judges. And so I want to end our session this morning by looking at those stories at the end of Judges and why they're there. Why are they included in the book of Judges, since they're not stories about Judges, and how those stories at the end of Judges illumine the whole book of Judges and the themes of the book of Judges. Before I start all that, I want to highlight a couple of chronological points about the book of Judges. And I do this partly because I'm not spending a lot of time this week looking at this kind of question about the historical accuracy of these accounts. I think all the accounts that we have that we're talking about are historically accurate. What the Bible records are things that actually happened, and they actually happened the way that they're recorded. And that goes down even to questions about timing and chronology, geography. I want to at least touch on some of the chronological issues that come up with the book of Judges. Biblical chronology has, in the last 150 years or so, many Bible scholars have thought that the Bible does not present an accurate or consistent chronology. That is, a chronology counting off years and having a datable timeline. Earlier ages, of course, believe that the Bible does have a consistent and coherent chronology. Augustine, in his great book, The City of God, spends part of one of his books tracing the chronology of the early centuries of humanity based on the ages of the people who are recorded in the line of Seth. And he argues that you can basically get a chronology of the ancient world. You know how long there was between the creation of the world and the time of Solomon. You can just count it up by looking at the different ages and the chronological notes that are in the Bible. You might know the name. Can't remember his first name, but he was an archbishop in England named Usher, Archbishop Usher, in the 17th century, I think. Did a chronological study of the Bible and determined that the world had been created in around 4000 BC. There were about 4,000 years total up until the time of Christ. And so the age of the world is about 6,000 years, according to Usher. And again, those kind of calculations have often been disparaged in the modern world, and it's biblical scholars rely much more on other cultures' chronologies than on the Bible's chronology. Other cultures provide, you have king lists in Babylon, for example, that lists the kings and the ages of the kings. and they total those up, and here's a different chronology. I think the Bible is concerned with history, with what actually happens in human history, with the sequence of events in human history. And clearly the Bible is interested in the timing of events in human history. And the reason you know that is because it keeps mentioning the timing of events, how long things take. There's this kind of information is all over the place, especially in the Old Testament. So it's just not true to say that the biblical writers are not interested in a timeline. They clearly are interested in a timeline. So there are a couple of chronological points to bring up about the book of Judges. One of them has to do with the overall time period of the book of Judges. In 1 Kings 6:1, we're told that it came about in the 480th year after the sons of Israel came out from the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, which is the 2nd month, he began to build the house of the Lord. 480 years from the Exodus, the time that Israel came out of Egypt, until the day when Solomon began to build the house, or at least the year that he began to build the house. And it gives us the month of the year when he's beginning to build it. So 480 years has some numbers are significant in the Bible. We can at least take note of 480 being, you could factor it into a 12 times 40, 12 being the number of Israel, 40 is the number of the stereotypical number of a generation. So 12 generations between the time of the Exodus and the time of Solomon. And there are other things that might fit in with that number. I'm just looking at the literal number at this point, 480 years. So the problem with that in terms of judges is that if you calculate and just count up the periods of all the judges, that period alone, which begins 47 years after the Exodus, because you had the 40 years in the wilderness and then 7 years of conquest. So the book of Judges begins at Joshua's death, 47 years after the Exodus. And then you have, if you total up the number of years of all the judges, it comes out to be around 590. And you're not even to Saul yet in those 590 years. So we're already over 600 years between the Exodus and Samson. And then you have Samuel and Saul's reign, which is 40 years. There's some confusion. There's some work to do on figuring out how long Saul's reign was, but I think it was 40 years long. David's reign is 40 years long, and then another 4 years before Solomon begins building. So you're over 700 years if you just total up all the numbers. But 1 Kings says that it's 480 years between the Exodus and the beginning of the temple. So what do we make of that? That would be, for some people, that would be a sign of an inconsistent timeline in the Bible. The writer of Kings is working with one timeline. Maybe he's using that 480 number purely for symbolic reasons. It's not a real number. It's just a symbolic number because it so neatly ties in with Israel, and it's 12 generations and an Israel number of generations from the Exodus to the temple. And it's just a symbolic number. Or perhaps there's different they're counting differently somehow. Okay. I think the better solution is to take both numbers, to say that the numbers and the judges are real, and the 480 years is real, but the time period, the judges are not simply sequential. You don't just, one judge total up the number of the years, and then the next judge total up the number of the years, the next judge total up the number of the years. Rather, judges are working in different parts of the land simultaneously. Okay. So you can see this. If you look carefully at where judges are, they're not always in the same place, and they're not dealing with all of Israel at the same time. Sometimes they're dealing with a tribe or a couple of tribes. In another part of Israel, another judge is arising and ruling. Okay. If you work out the chronology of the latter part of Judges, which is in terms of the sequence of judges, Samson is the last one who's recorded. Samson is alive at the same time as Samuel. Samuel does not appear in the book of Judges. He doesn't come up until the beginning of 1 Samuel, of course. He's born in the first chapter of 1 Samuel, when Hannah's prayer at the beginning of Samuel. But even though he's in a different book, you don't just add that. Those are historically they're overlapping. I'm not going to go into the detailed discussion of how we can figure that out, but there are indications that they're overlapping. Possibly also Jephthah, another judge, he's a little bit older, but about the same time as Samson and Samuel. Samson and Samuel are about the same age, born at about the same time, and working in Israel in the same time. And once you put that chronology together, then several things kind of fall into place. The fact that Samson and Samuel are both dealing with Philistines, you think, okay, Samson ends his life toppling down the temple of Dagon, where all of the nobility of Philistia is gathered together for a festival. And then Samuel comes along. If Samuel is not at the same time as Samson, Samuel comes along, and the Philistines have somehow recovered from that catastrophe and are again oppressing Israel, and Samuel is also dealing with the time when the Philistines are ascendant. Okay. If you put them end to end, it doesn't make much sense. If you put them next to each other, it makes a lot more sense. Samson knocks down the temple of Dagon. Many of the nobility of the Philistines die. That's about the same time that Samuel is leading a battle against the Philistines, and the Lord is victorious in that battle, and the Philistines are routed. Okay. Or you can put together the scenes of the ark going around from town to town in Philistia. The ark put in the temple of Dagon at the beginning of Samuel, and Dagon, the fish god of the Philistine, keeps bowing down to the ark. Remember that story? The Philistines captured the ark and they put it in their temple. This is a sign that their God is stronger than Israel's God. They can take the throne of Israel's God, and that now becomes Yahweh, the God of Israel, basically becomes a subordinate God to Dagon. But then Dagon knows better, and every morning when the priests go into Dagon's temple, Dagon is fallen down in front of the ark. He's acknowledging the supremacy of Yahweh, and then he breaks in pieces. I guess his feet and his hands break off or something. I don't remember exactly what happens. But Dagon falls and he can't get up and he starts to crack. Okay, that's happening in the same vicinity of time that's happening a little bit before the time when Samson is fighting the Philistines and then having this major blow against the Philistines at the time of his death. Okay, so that's again. I'm not going to take time. I don't have my notes in front of me to explain all the details of that. But I think it's helpful to see that this chronology is much more compressed than it can look like, and these judges are not always right after the other. They're operating at the same time and shoving together. Well, the latter part of Judges and the beginning of 1 Samuel really are taking place simultaneously as a historical issue. The other chronological question that comes up internally to Judges is concerning the latter episodes in the book of Judges. Okay, if you're reading the book of Judges and you think one judge follows the other, and we're being given a simple historical chronicle of one judge and then the next judge and then the next judge and then the next judge. And then you get to the latter chapters when the judges disappear and other kinds of stories are being told. Then those are later than Samson. So you end the series of Judges with Samson. Chapter 17 begins the story of Micah. And then you have the story of the Levite and his concubine. Those stories must happen after Samson because they're put after the story of Samson in the book. But if you look at Judges 20, verse 28, this is in the aftermath of the incident with the Levite and his concubine. We'll talk about that at the end of our session this morning. And Israel goes to inquire of the Lord about what they should do. And verse 28 says, Phineas, the son of Eleazar, Aaron's son, Eleazar is Aaron's son, stood before to minister in those days, saying, shall I yet go up to the battle against the sons of my brother Benjamin, or shall I not? And the Lord said, go up, for tomorrow I will deliver them into your hand. Okay. Phineas is the grandson of Aaron. Phineas, anybody know where we've met Phineas earlier in the Bible? Yeah, you got it. The book of Numbers, when Balaam organizes a seduction of Israel, and Israel is seduced into idolatry, and the men are seduced into adultery. And Phineas, there's a plague breaks out, and Phineas the priest brings an end to the plague by impaling with a spear, a couple that's fornicating inside a tent, pins them to the ground, kills them together, and then the Lord stops the plague because of Phineas' zeal for the holiness of God. Okay, that's the same guy who is the high priest during the time of this incident at the end of the book of Judges. So even on a short chronology of the book of Judges, if this incident is happening after Samson, we're still talking about Phineas being 200 some years old. That's not true. He didn't live to be 200 some years old. So what that indicates to us is that this story is something that takes place fairly early in the history of the Judges. And then that raises a question about the organization and the shape of the book, right? Why would the writer of Judges put this incident about the Levite and his concubine, which took place early in the period of Judges, why would he put that way? This is the last story at the end of Judges. Why would he do that? Why would he put something out of chronological order? Okay, we'll come back to that question later on, but that's a question that's internal to Judges. But you need to pay careful attention to the details of the text that have these chronological indications, because they may end up being important for the interpretation of certain passages when you realize that things are being organized not simply because of chronological sequence, but they're being organized for some other reason. There's some reason why the writer of the Judges wants the book to climax with that incident rather than to climax with the story of Samson. That raises an important interpretive question. Okay, let's read a little bit of the first chapter of Judges, and I'll go into the second chapter a bit too. And this will introduce us to the basic structure and themes of the book of Judges, and then we'll focus in on a couple of particular ones. Now it came about after the death of Joshua that the sons of Israel inquired of the Lord, saying, who shall go up for us against the Canaanites to fight against them? And Yahweh said, Judah shall go up. Behold, I have given the land into his hand. Then Judah said to Simeon his brother, come up with me into the territory allotted to me, that we may fight against the Canaanites, and I will return, go with you into the territory allotted you. So Judah and Simeon are going to cooperate. Simeon went with them. And Judah went up, and the Lord gave the Canaanites and the Perizzites into their hands, and they defeated 10,000 men at Bezek. And they found Adonai-Bezek in Bezek and fought against him and defeated the Canaanites and the Perizzites. And Adonai-Bezek fled, and they pursued him and caught him and cut off his thumbs and his big toes. And Adonai-Bezek said, 70 kings with their thumbs and their big toes cut off used to gather scraps under my table. As I have done, so God has repaid me. And they brought him to Jerusalem. Okay. Just a note on the last thing. Why? Why do that to a conquered king? Why thumbs and big toes? They don't kill him. Okay. We've got opposable thumbs along with some primates, which means we can grab things like swords. Cut off thumbs, he's not going to be much of a warrior. You cut off his big toe, that destabilizes you. Okay. It's hard to walk when you're lacking a big toe. So they've disabled him. It's also retribution, of course, because he used to do the same thing to the kings he conquered. And now God has brought the same fate on him. It's an eye for eye, tooth for tooth kind of justice that the Lord is enacting against this king. So, a couple things in this opening sequence. After the death of Joshua, the book begins with death, as Judges did. Moses dies. The death of Moses is mentioned at the beginning of Joshua. And that raises the question, what is going to happen to Israel after the death of this great leader? Are they going to continue in the trajectory that Moses had set for them? Or are they going to follow the ways of the Lord that were revealed through Moses? Or are they going to deviate from that? And we saw yesterday that in terms of Joshua, the answer is that the Lord raises Joshua as a second Moses. And he's going to become, he does a lot of things that Moses did, and he keeps the law before him, he acts faithfully, and he leads Israel into conquest. Yeah, Emmanuel. Okay. So the question comes up here again at the beginning of the book of Judges. Now Joshua, the second Moses, is dead. Is Israel going to continue on in the trajectory that they were given? And the first section suggests to us that they are. Okay. Remember yesterday we talked about the distribution of the land doesn't mean that Israel's fighting is over. The Lord is enthroned as the king of the land, but there's still territories that need to be conquered and need to be brought under Yahweh's control and under Yahweh's rule. His kingdom has to spread all throughout the land, and it hasn't yet. And the way that's going to happen is by individual tribes continuing the conquest in their own territories. So they get a parcel of land, they get the dimensions and boundaries of their territory, but there's still Canaanites in many of these places, and they're supposed to carry on those battles as individual tribes. Okay, and Judah is doing that, right? Judah is cooperating with Simeon, and Judah and Simeon together are fighting against the Canaanites and the Perizzites and against Adonai-Bezek, and they defeat Adonai-Bezek, and it looks like the leaders of Judah and the leaders of Simeon, at least, are going to carry on the program that Joshua started. So Joshua dies, something like a new Joshua comes to birth in the tribes of Judah and Simeon. And that continues in the account of Judah up through verse 20 of chapter 1. There's a couple of other little incidents that are in there that I won't take time to look at. But Judah starts out well. But then verse 21 says, "But the sons of Benjamin did not drive out the Jebusites who lived in Jerusalem. So the Jebusites have lived with the sons of Benjamin in Jerusalem to this day. Likewise, the house of Joseph went up against Bethel. The Lord was with them. And the house of Joseph spied out Bethel. And the spies saw a man coming out of the city. They said to him, 'Please show us an entrance to the city. We'll treat you kindly.' He showed them the entrance to the city, and they struck the city with the edge of the sword, but they let the man and his family go free. And the man went into the land of the Hittites and built a city and called it Luz. That is its name until this day." Okay. So Benjamin doesn't conquer. Joseph, that's the tribe of Ephraim, conquers. Verse 27, Manasseh did not take possession of Bethshean and all these other territories. And then it continues, it ends up with a list of 7 of the tribes. And after Judah and Simeon are doing well and Ephraim is doing pretty well, the other tribes that are listed here in chapter 1 are not fulfilling the program. They're not carrying out the mission. The mission is to conquer. They're supposed to continue to clear all the idols out of the land so that everyone in the land worships the Lord. And Zebulun and Asher and Naphtali don't do that. And in fact, by the time we get to Naphtali, it's not only that they're not conquering the Canaanites, but they become forced labor and slaves to the Canaanites. So with Naphtali, the relationship between Israel and the Canaanites is reversed. Verse 33 says, "Naphtali did not drive out the inhabitants of Beth-Shemesh, or the inhabitants of Beth-Anah, but lived among the Canaanites, the inhabitants of the land, and the inhabitants of Beth-Shemesh and Beth-Anah, or Anath, became forced labor for them. For the Amorites forced the sons of Dan into the hill country, and they did not allow them to come down to the hills. Yet the Amorites persisted in living in Mount Perez, in Aijalon and Shalabim, and when the power of the house of Joseph grew strong, they became forced labor. Okay. But Naphtali doesn't drive out the Canaanites. It looks like, I think I might have misread that. It looks like the people of the land become forced labor for them. In any case, these tribes are not carrying out the mission that they were given by Joshua. So Joshua's death has created the crisis. Some of the tribes are carrying on the mission that they're supposed to, but many are not. And as we'll see throughout the book of Judges, instead of controlling and conquering the Canaanites and related tribes end up controlling and conquering Israel. Now, the question is, why is this happening? What's wrong with the tribes of Israel that they're not fulfilling this mission? And we could anticipate from our study in Joshua and from the book of Deuteronomy that the issue is not a question of military tactics or, military tactics or of military courage, but the issue is one of obedience to the Lord. Okay. And that's what we find out at the beginning of chapter 2. So we have a mixed result at the beginning of this period of the Judges. And then the angel of Yahweh comes to the sons of Israel and brings these charges against them. The angel of Yahweh is functioning like a prophet. We'll talk about prophets when we get to the book of Kings later in the week. Prophets are, among other things, prophets are bring the Lord's lawsuit against Israel. Israel violates the covenant, and the prophet comes and brings charges against Israel and says, here are the ways that you've broken covenant, and here are the consequences of your failure to keep covenant. And that's what this angel is doing at the beginning of chapter 2. The angel of the Lord came from Gilgal to Bochim, and he said, I brought you out of the land of Egypt and led you to the land which I swore to your fathers, and I said, I will never break my covenant with you. As for you, you shall make no covenant with the inhabitants of the land. You shall tear down their altars, but you have not obeyed me. What is this that you have done? Therefore I also said, I will not drive them out before you, but they shall become as thorns in your sides, and their gods shall be a snare to you. And it came about when the angel of the Lord spoke these words to all the sons of Israel, the people lifted up their voices and wept. And they named the place Bochim, and there they sacrificed to the Lord. So the reason why they're not conquering has to do with their failure to obey the Lord. They are not tearing down the shrines as they were commanded to. And so the Lord is leaving those tribes, those other peoples in the land to be a source of to be thorns in their sides, and to be like be a curse to them rather than being driven out. Okay. And chapter 2 also recounts for us the basic recurring cycle of events that happens over and over again in the book of Judges. Beginning in verse 11, it says, the sons of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals. They forsook the Lord, the God of their fathers, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt, and followed other gods from among the gods of the peoples who were around them, and bowed themselves down to them. Thus they provoked the Lord to anger. They forsook the Lord and served Baal and Ashtaroth. And the anger of the Lord burned against Israel. Thank you. And he gave them into the hand of the plunderers who plundered them. And he sold them into the hands of the enemies around them, so they could not stand against their enemies. Wherever they went, the hand of the Lord was against them for evil, as the Lord had spoken, and as the Lord had sworn to them, so they were severely distressed. Then the Lord raised up judges who delivered them from the hands of those who plundered them. Yet they did not listen to their judges, for they played the harlot after their other gods and bowed themselves down to them. They turned aside quickly from the way in which their fathers had walked in obeying the commandments of the Lord, and they did not do as their fathers. When the Lord raised up judges for them, the Lord was with the judge and delivered them from the hand of their enemies all the days of the judge, for the Lord was moved to pity by their groaning because of those who oppressed and afflicted them. But it came about when the judge died that they would turn back and act more corruptly than their fathers in following other gods to serve and bow down to them. They did not abandon the practices or their stubborn ways. So the anger of the Lord burned against Israel. Okay, that's the cycle we're going to see over and over again. Israel is going to begin to serve the gods of the nations that surround them. The Lord says, you want to serve the gods of the nations? You want to be like the Midianites. You want to be like the Philistines. You want to be like the Amorites. Okay, I'll show you what it's like living like an Amorite. I'll send the Amorites in, or the Midianites in, or the Moabites in, and they'll conquer you, and then you can be what you wanted to be, which is, you can be Midianites. We're serving the Midianite gods. The Lord gives them over, hands them over to the sin that they're already committing, in a sense, right? They're already serving the gods of these nations, and the Lord says, okay, why don't you just go full in and become members of these nations? And he does that by sending conquerors to them. And when the conquerors have oppressed Israel, Israel is greatly distressed, and the people begin to cry out to the Lord for deliverance. End of verse 18. The Lord was moved to pity by the groaning of those who had oppressed them. So they cry out to the Lord, and the Lord, in his mercy, raises up a judge who delivers them. A judge in the book of Judges, most of the judges we never see them acting like judges in the sense that we think of a judge. That is, hearing cases and passing sentences and verdicts. The one judge that really functions that way is Deborah. We see her holding court in Judges chapter 4. She's holding court under a tree. So people would come up to her with problem cases, and she'd judge them. Most of the judges they're judges in the sense that they're agents of God's judgment. They're carrying out God's judgment against Israel's oppressors. And they're judges in the sense that they're rulers. But usually we don't hear much about what they're doing after they've delivered Israel. We know that they rule for a certain period of time, but exactly how they rule and what their responsibilities are, we don't know. So the Lord listens to Israel, responds, and sends a deliverer. Israel is raised up out of their oppression, given a new lease on life, and they serve the Lord and continue to worship the Lord as long as the judge lives. And then the death of the judge is again the crisis point, just like the death of Joshua was the crisis point. And every time a judge dies, a judge who has led Israel in faithfulness for the time of his life, during his lifetime, every time a judge dies, Israel just slips right back in to serving other gods. I mean, one way to think about this Christologically is that what Israel needs is a judge who doesn't die. They need a permanent judge, right? Or a judge who dies and then comes back and won't die again. Because the death of the judge, the death of the ruler is the big crisis point. And it's because the reign of death, Israel is under the reign of death. That's why Israel keeps falling back into sin. Okay, so this whole cycle is the cycle of the Exodus. Israel was in Egypt. They are initially favored by Pharaoh, right? Because of Joseph. They're given the land of Goshen. They have kind of independence in the land of Goshen. And because of Joseph's influence, the Pharaoh treats them well. Well, then a Pharaoh arises who does not know Joseph, and the Pharaoh puts them to hard labor. He gets frightened because they're reproducing too fast. There's too many Israelites, and he's worried that if Egypt is attacked by another nation, that the Israelites will join the other nation and begin fighting for them. Like if Russia attacks Ukraine, there might be Russians in Ukraine who join with the Russian troops, and a fifth column, it's called. So Pharaoh is worried that the Israelites would become enemies if somebody else invades. So he tries to halt the growth and the expansion of Israel by killing the boy children of Israel and putting Israel to hard labor. Okay, so you have the same scene at the beginning of Exodus as you have repeatedly in Judges with the people of Israel under the oppression of a foreign power, an oppressive, unjust, evil power. And Israel in Egypt groans and cries out, and the Lord hears their groaning. That's what he tells Moses when the Lord calls Moses at the burning bush. I have heard their cries, I've heard their groaning, and I'm raising you up, Moses, as their deliverer. Moses is kind of the model judge who leads Israel out of the land of Egypt, and he delivers them from that oppression. And as long as he lives, Israel remains more or less faithful. I mean, there's certainly ups and downs in Israel's life. Okay. But then Moses dies, and we have the crisis again. And in that case, things go well after the death of the deliverer. They're not going well after the death of the judges. The one thing that seems a little odd when we say each of the judges is a kind of new Moses, delivering Israel from another kind of Pharaoh, another Egyptian kind of oppression. They don't lead them out of the land. They don't make a geographic transition, but they make a transition in their political and economic and social circumstances. They're delivered. They're no longer slaves, and they're freed to be independent again. The one thing that seems an anomaly is to go back to the beginning of the cycle. The beginning of the cycle in Judges is Israel's idolatry, right? That's why the Lord sends the foreign powers in, because Israel has turned from the Lord to other gods, and the Lord gives them over to their idolatry and gives them over to the nations who serve those idols. So is that part of the original Exodus story? If you read the book of Exodus, it doesn't seem so. It looks like Israel is expanding, Israel is getting stronger, and then you just randomly have this Pharaoh that starts oppressing them and killing infant boys and putting them to hard labor and trying to stamp them out. But we find out actually at the end of the book of Joshua that Israel had been worshiping the gods of the Egyptians while in Egypt. Look at Joshua 24, 14 and 15. This is in the last, I talked briefly about this yesterday. We have this covenant renewal event at the end of the book of Joshua. And this is part of Joshua's exhortation to the people. Now therefore fear Yahweh and serve him in sincerity and truth, and put away the gods which your fathers served beyond the river. That's the river Euphrates. Those would be the gods of the Babylonians. And in Egypt, and serve Yahweh. And if it is disagreeable in your sight to serve the Lord, choose for yourselves today whom you will serve, whether the gods whom your fathers served when they were beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you are living. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Okay. So verse 14 tells us that it's the first time we learn about this. You read through Exodus. If you're reading straight through the Bible, you read through Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers and all of Deuteronomy and almost all of Joshua. And suddenly a key element of the Exodus story is revealed in this final speech of Joshua, that Israel was serving the Egyptian gods. And one of the reasons why Israel was given over to Pharaoh was because the Lord was judging them for their idolatry. Okay. That's one of the things that once you have that in mind, then you can start seeing some other things that are happening in the book of Exodus that are interesting. The first three plagues hit both Israel and Egypt, the land of Goshen and the Egyptians. After that, the Lord makes a distinction, and the plagues only fall on the Egyptians. Well, you think about that. Think about that in the light of Joshua 24:14. The Lord is judging Egypt at the beginning of the plagues, but that includes the Israelites because they basically become Egyptians by worshiping the Egyptian gods. So part of the point of the first three plagues is to call Israel away from the gods of Egypt, to create the distinction between Israel and Egypt. It's almost as if that distinction didn't exist, but once the plagues start coming, and Moses tells the people, if you want to escape the plagues, you need to serve the Lord. The plagues are going to keep coming, so if you want to escape them, serve the Lord, separate yourself from the Egyptians, Those judgments are part of the Lord's creation of a separate Israel, because Israel had become assimilated to the Egyptians, as they are continuously assimilated to these different nations in the book of Judges. Okay. So each of these cycles in the book of Judges, you have this over and over again. You have 7 primary judges. I have those listed on your notes. You have 7 primary judges and then a handful of lesser judges. But in each case, you have the same cycle. Idolatry, the Lord gives them over to their idolatry, which means they're enslaved by some foreign power. When they're enslaved, they cry out to the Lord for deliverance, and the Lord hears them, and the Lord responds by raising up a judge. And as long as the judge is alive, they're faithful. Then the judge dies, they go back to idolatry. They go back into slavery. They cry out. The Lord raises another judge. The judge dies. They go back into idolatry. Okay. I'm going to act that out for you. This is the moment of drama, dramatic arts in our lecture today. This is the way I taught my kids the book of Judges when they were little. It starts simply. This is the book of Judges in a very simple form. You'll notice I'm walking in something like a circle. Same thing happening over and over again, right? That's the book of Judges. Now we add drama, gestures. Okay. It starts with idolatry, bowing down to foreign gods. It leads to slavery and oppression. So the gesture here is that I'm the slave master with a whip. Whoosh, whoosh. Then the people are enslaved in their whip. They cry out to the Lord. And the Lord raises up a judge. And then the judge dies and the people go back. Okay. Okay, you get the idea. I have no encore. All right. That's what's happening throughout the book of Judges, over and over and over again. Israel can't get out of this cycle. One thing to note here that will lead us to get us a perspective on the latter portions of Judges. One thing to notice here is that this is a story of Israel's political history, because they're constantly being enslaved by other nations, conquered and enslaved by other nations. But the real root of that political history is not political, or it's not about their political system or the quality of their leaders or anything. The root problem is idolatry. And I think that's one of the main lessons of the book of Judges, and one that we can apply universally. I mean, in the States, Christians are agitated often by political trends and cultural trends. I'm agitated by political and cultural trends. I'm not trying to distance myself from those worries. There are a number of ways in which our country is drifting from a Christian heritage, drifting from God, drifting from any semblance of biblical morality. And the tendency and the instinct is to try to find political solutions. And that happens a lot in the United States. You have various people that try to get some kind of organize around certain candidates for office, around a certain political figure. A messianic political figure like Donald J. Trump, the Messiah of America, the Savior of the world. Strangely, weirdly, a lot of Christians in America think Trump in that way. That's a bizarre thing. But in any case, they try to find political solutions. But that's just hitting the symptom. The issue is not the political system or the political leaders. The root issue is always idolatry. Who are the people of God worshiping? And have they given their hearts over to some kind of idol? And that can, in Judges, it's obvious when Israel's worshiping idols. Because this is an encore. It's obvious that they're worshiping idols because they're doing this, right? There's images there, and they're bowing down to the images of false gods, okay? The idols of modern Christians are much more subtle, you know. Idolatries of money, idolatries of power, idolatries of comfort and safety, and other kinds of, it's ultimately idolatry of the self. Those are much more subtle, but idolatry is always the issue. That doesn't mean that that addressing the political circumstances is useless or unimportant, but it doesn't get to the heart of things. It doesn't really get to the root. So the issue, if you're in a situation where there's political turmoil, and if you're in a situation where Christians are kind of being marginalized or even persecuted, that can be they're sharing in the sufferings of Christ. But you always need to be thinking, is this discipline for our idolatries? And is the Lord putting us under this oppression in order to wake us up and to help lead us to turn from other gods? Okay. All right. I'll say a few more things, and then we'll take a break. I think I want to take a break. Yeah, I'll say a few more things, and from the notes, highlight a couple of things on these the structural issues that I have there. I've reproduced a chiastic outline that comes from Jim Jordan's commentary on Judges, that showing the chiasm of the book of Judges. I'm not going to spend time with that except to point to the center of the book of Judges, which in Jim's analysis is the judgeship of Gideon in chapters 6 through 8. And we'll be looking at that after our break. And the reason why that's central, I think, is because that, and particularly that in combination with the next chapter, which is the story of Abimelech, who is Gideon's son, those two chapters together are the central chapters that deal with the question of kingship in the book of Judges. Abimelech is the one judge who takes the title of king to himself. But Gideon, as we'll see, already begins to take on the trappings of a king, even before he doesn't take the title. Although Avimelech, anybody know what Abimelech, Avimelech, what does that mean? Yeah, Avi, it's a Semitic. Yav, you've got it in your name. Father. Avi is my father, and Melech is king. So Gideon never calls himself king. In fact, he refuses kingship, but then he calls his son, my father is king. Okay. All right. So Gideon is a faithful judge, but then as an outline shows, he falls, and we'll look at that in more detail. But that raises the question of kingship in Israel. Abimelech is the one guy who calls himself king, and he's a disaster. And that's important for understanding what's happening, again, in the latter chapters of Judges, because it's in those last chapters, the last 5 chapters, that you have this refrain, there was no king in Israel, everyone did what was right in his own eyes. There was no king in Israel, everyone did what is right in his own eyes. So the latter chapters are dealing with kingship too, but we have to read those latter chapters and what they're saying about kingship in the light of what happens at the center of the book with Gideon and Abimelech. Okay, so we'll come back to that after the break. I have the list of the 7 major judges there on your notes, just for your reference. And then another indication of the symmetry or the organization of the book is you have a bookends around, call them bookends around the book, similar scenes at the beginning and end of a book. That's often a simple way to get a sense of the flow of a biblical book. Look at the situation at the beginning, look at the situation at the end. What has changed and what's the same between the two? And that can often give you a clue to some of the basic themes of the book. Like the book of Exodus, for example, begins in Egypt, ends at Sinai. At the beginning of the book of Exodus, Israel is building for Pharaoh. At the end of the book of Exodus, Moses has just built the tabernacle. At the beginning of Exodus, Israel, they're slaves of Pharaoh. At the end of Exodus, they've been freed from Pharaoh, but they're still servants. They're slaves of Yahweh. So that there's a transfer of master that's gone on. They were given labor in Egypt without any rest. You have to make bricks without straw, and you have to work continuously. And you can't go 3 days into the wilderness and celebrate a feast to Yahweh. Pharaoh won't let them do that. At the end of Exodus, they're in the wilderness. They're celebrating a feast to Yahweh in the wilderness. And one of the dominant themes of the latter part of Exodus is repeated commands to keep Sabbath. They've moved from slavery to Sabbath. That's one of the big thematic movements of the book of Exodus. So if you look at the bookends, the two ends of the book, you can often get a sense of the whole sweep. Here I'm just pointing to these couple of scenes at the beginning and end of the book, just to show that there's a kind of symmetry between the beginning and end. At the beginning of the book, we have this little scene with Caleb. This is in chapter 1, 11 through 15. Caleb offers the city to anyone who, actually offers his daughter as a bride to anyone who would conquer a city. The conqueror receives the bride from the father. Okay. And then we have his daughter Aksa comes up on her donkey and asks her father for the springs of water, in addition to the city that her husband has won. Okay. Maybe a neat little typology there. The father offers a bride to the conqueror, and the conqueror becomes his son-in-law. The father offers the bride, the church, to the conqueror, his son. And his son receives, and his new daughter-in-law receives the springs of water, life-giving spirit. I think a little glimpse of the gospel there. So we have a woman on a donkey. Chapter 19, toward the end of the book, the part of the story of the Levite and the concubine is the concubine's corpse on a donkey. Right? That's a jarring juxtaposition. We have women on donkeys at the two ends of the book, but it's a very different kind of scene. We have Aksa, the daughter of Caleb, at the one hand, who is petitioning her father for additional blessing, and she is a bride. At the end, we have a dead bride, a dead concubine, who's been raped and abused to death in the Benjamite city of Gibeah. Okay, those two scenes, which have the similar motif of the woman on a donkey, those two scenes kind of summarize the decline and the decay of Israel during the time of the Judges. We have the same thing with the Karam warfare, which we have just references to that in the opening chapter, explicit reference in chapter 1, verse 17. Judah went with Simeon and his brother, and they struck the Canaanites living in Zephath, and utterly destroyed it. Utterly destroy is the word for Karam. Put it under the ban. So the name was called Hormah Karam. The name of the city is named because it was put under Karam. Okay, that's Karam warfare directed at Canaanites, which is what Israel's supposed to be doing. At the end of the book, in the last scene, I'll anticipate what I'm going to discuss in more detail, but the Levite and his concubine come into the Benjamite city of Gibeah. The men of Gibeah want to know the Levite. Know the Levite. And they surround the house where he's staying. This is Sodom. Okay, this is the same scene as happens in Genesis 18 and 19. Gibeah, a city in Benjamin, a city in Israel, has become a Sodom. And when the other tribes, the Levite takes his concubine, divides up the body of the concubine into 12 pieces, and sends the dismembered corpse, parts of the dismantled corpse of his concubine, out to the different tribes. Okay. A message about what the city of Gibeah has done. A gruesome message. And is calling on the tribes of Israel to come and do something about it, to intervene. And the Benjamites refuse, instead of turning over their brothers in the city of Gibeah to be tried and punished for their sin, they defend Gibeah. And so we have a battle a war at the end of the book of Judges, not between Israelites and Canaanites, but between all the tribes of Israel and Benjamin. Okay? And they carry out a kind of harem warfare against the Benjamites, leaving the Benjamites destroyed and bereft. There's a little upturn at the end of the book of Judges that we'll talk about, end of that story that we'll talk about. But again, we see the shift or the decline in the book of Judges in those two little scenes at the beginning and the end of the book. At the beginning, at least, some of the tribes are doing what they're supposed to do, continuing the warfare against the Canaanites. But at the end of the book, it's all devolved into civil war. And we have the corruptions of Sodom, the corruptions of the Canaanites have taken root in the tribe of Benjamin, and we have harem warfare being conducted against one of the tribes of Israel.